before I begin, I want to first thank Dr. Ogden, the students of the Bioinformatics Club for extending this invitation. And there's something I have not told them, which I'm about to tell them now. I have had many honors over the course of my career. I have keynoted many congresses, international and national. But this is the first time I've been asked to be the keynote speaker on Darwin Day. And I wanted you to know it was your effort that brought this into being. So thank you very much. I'm going to try something and see if this works. I'm going to leave the mic here. Can you hear me? Everyone's good. All right, so the title of my talk today is A Voice in the Wilderness. A Pioneering Biologist Explains How Evolution Can Help Us Solve Our Biggest Problems. Now, of course, it's based on the book of the same title. The purpose of this book was to acquaint readers with my pioneering journey as the world's first African-American evolutionary biologist. Now, it's divided in two parts. The first is the unexpected path. It's autobiographical. It focuses on my early life, education, first significant scientific problems, my work studying lakes and rivers, parasitology, community ecology, chaos theory, evolution, and the physiology of aging. Part two is where I focus on how evolution can help us solve our biggest problems. And that addresses my fight with scientific racism, the relationship between science and religion, and my recent work in the genomics of adaptation, as well as science and social justice. So to give you some perspective, I was born 4 months before Emmett Till was lynched in Money, Mississippi. I entered a public school system that had no expectation that someone like me would ever amount to anything that had any association with intellectual activity. In fact, racial tracking was the general rule in school systems around the nation, including the one that I was in. So me being a relatively bright child, when I was placed in a class that had little expectation for me, I was finished my work before everybody else. And so what do you think a 5-year-old little boy does when they're bored? Because they have nothing to do. Do you think they're going to sit at their desk? No. So one day I decided I would be an airplane. So I got up out of my seat, wings out, propeller noise, flew around the classroom, and of course, I ended up in the principal's office. And the principal called my mother off work. Now, for those of you with working class backgrounds like mine, you know that a kid's greatest dread is having your mother come to school off of work. I thought I was going to die. But my mother came in and they told her that I was a problem child. And this is kindergarten. I'm a problem child, and that they wanted to put me in special education because they thought that I was mentally retarded. And that's a term that they used at that time. My mother pitched a fit in that place. She said, "You are not putting my son in special education." Now, what interested me when I wrote Voice was I looked in the scholarly literature, and it turns out that that practice is ongoing. So I recount a case in the opening chapter that was set in the late 1990s. And a kid who very much resembled me was transferred into special education, and then ended up dropping out of school. So I was in 3rd grade when I had a fateful encounter with the diva Caissa. For those of you who don't know your Roman mythology, she is the goddess of chess. So on my way to school, there were some big kids sitting on the school stoop, and they were playing chess. Being an inquisitive 3rd grader, I was like, hey, guys, teach me how to play. Teach me how to play. And of course, like, get out of here, kid, get out of here. And so finally, one of them took the time to teach me the moves. I played him in that game. He beat me mercilessly. But on my free period, I walked to the school library. I looked up all the books they had on chess. The one that I gravitated to was Bobby Fischer's classic, Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess. You didn't need to know chess notation to read his book because it was designed to follow by diagrams, and it had problems at the end of every chapter and the answers at the end of the book. So I stayed up all night in my room with the covers over my head and a flashlight, because you know, if mom came in and caught you awake, you knew you were in big trouble. So next day, I go to school and I'm looking for those kids again. And they're there, and I sit down and I demolished every one of them. By the time I was in 7th grade, I was junior high school champion. By the time I went to high school, I was on 3rd board of our nationally ranked chess team. And so I credit chess, and by the way, I still am an active chess player. I play for the Burlington Ambush in the International Chess League, for the skill set that allowed me to become a scientist, particularly the ability to look deeply into scientific problems and question the assumptions which led those authors to arrive at their incorrect conclusion. So, as a graduate student, University of Michigan, I studied the mathematics of complex problems, was under the direction of John Vandermeer, who, by the way, if you don't know, was the first person to use a ANOVA table in a publication in ecology. So he's a direct descendant of Harrison, Slobodkin, and the founders of the field. I left Michigan, and I tell that story not because I was incapable of doing the work there, but during that time, my focus shifted to the issues of social justice and the injustices which were so glaringly apparent on my campus. And so between all the organizing I was doing, for example, one of the things you probably don't know is that the first graduate employee union to have a contract recognized by its university was the Graduate Employees Organization at the University of Michigan. I led the negotiating team that brought the university to the table and finally got them to sign the contract. I also led the Black Action Movement, which played an integral role in integrating the University of Michigan. And by the way, this is 1983 we're talking about, because other than athletes at Michigan, there were very few African-American students. So as a result, my grade point dropped below 3.0. The graduate dean happily penned a letter, sent it to me, throwing me out of the university. I then went to Detroit, spent a lot of time doing community organizing, and eventually decided to go back to graduate school to finish my degree in 1988, working on the problem of the evolution of aging. Now, to do that, I had to face down a psychological problem that didn't have a name in the 1980s. It was called imposter syndrome. Throughout the entire time I spent in higher education, I felt that all of my problems resulted from something that was wrong with me. So I internalized these things. As a result, I engaged in self-destructive behavior. Okay, I alienated people around me, alienated my professors, I alienated my friends. To put things in a summary, I was a hot mess in those days. But a fateful moment came when my professor, Leo Luckenbill, called me into his office. He said to me, "Joe, nobody doubts that you're a really smart person. But if you don't get in the lab tomorrow and start working on your research for your PhD thesis, I am cutting you loose." So understand the situation I was in. Okay. The greatest fear that I had in my life at that time was success. And in the course of an evening, I had to design an experiment that was suitable of working for a PhD thesis. So that's when I say I faced down imposter syndrome, because that's what I had to do. I had to say to myself, do you really want to be in this field? Do you really want to do this work? And after answering yes, I designed that experiment. And when Leo came into the lab the following day, I had already set up the first measurements I was going to take on the road to my thesis. So now, how did I work out this problem? So in 1984, and by the way, guys, this is 1987, so this is 3 years later. Michael Rose's laboratory had published a paper entitled "The Evolution of Postponed Senescence" in the journal Evolution. In this experiment, Michael had demonstrated that Peter Medawwar's theory of aging, which was the declining force of natural selection with the age of somatic tissue, was correct. He had experimentally altered the lifespan of fruit flies in the laboratory on a genetic basis. Now, his student, Phil Service, in 1985 demonstrated that flies that displayed postponed senescence or longer lifespan showed superior physiological performance in starvation, desiccation, and ethanol resistance. Now, Phil had discovered this by complete and total accident. And as Michael tells the story, one day he walks into the laboratory and his laboratory technician is at her desk in tears. Michael goes up to her and says, "Well, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" And she says, I killed all the flies. Michael went ballistic because this is like 10 years worth of laboratory work. And he's like running around the lab. Oh my God, flies are dead. He opens up the incubator and all the flies were alive. What had happened? The technician had opened a different incubator. The incubator she opened was the control group. She had forgotten to put the food in the cages over the weekend. So both groups had spent the weekend starving. The controls died. The postponed senescent populations lived. And then they realize there's something different about their physiology. And so Phil experimentally determines that this is due to something that had occurred during the selection for postponed senescence. Now, my advisor had produced flies using the same tactic. So instead of puttering around and accidentally discovering that their physiology must be different, I reasoned that their physiology had to be different. And where should you look for striking different physiological performances? In an organism called a fly. Let me think. Oh yeah, the flight mechanism of the organism called a fly. So I reasoned that they must have superior ability to fly. Now I just needed to measure that. So I knew that the flies had something called the tarsal reflex, meaning if you suspend the fly in the air, it will think that it has to fly. It doesn't know that it's being suspended by you. And they will fly until all of their energy reserves are exhausted. So I designed a really simple system. Duco cement, a light test fishing line, and a Pasteur pipette. Now, how did I know that Duco cement would work? I tried to repair stuff with Duco cement in my apartment. It never worked. Therefore, it was perfect for this experiment because I wanted the flies to survive being glued. I didn't want them to die. So I then tested the possibility that the short and long-lived flies would be flying at different speeds because maybe the short-lived flies are flying longer because they're just not trying as hard. They're not flying as fast. So I went to a colleague in the physics department, and first we tried a laser. And that wasn't a good experiment because we set up the apparatus so that we would send the laser beam into the path of the moving wings. And we reached for the button, turned on the apparatus, and poof, fly explodes. We're like, oh gosh, that laser has way too much energy for the fly. So we then decided, okay, bad idea. Let's use ultraviolet. So we then decided, actually infrared, sorry, decided to use infrared. And we designed a flight tachometer that allowed us to measure instantaneous wing beat frequency. And here is a diagram of the apparatus. Okay, so we had an infrared emitter detector. The fly's wings break the beam. The wave shaper sent it to a counter circuit, which then sent it to the IBM and allowed us to display the speed of the fly. Now, this is actually a picture of those taken from those original experiments. And there the fly is flying, caught in mid-beat, and we showed that the wings were much faster in the long-lived flies than the short-lived flies. So they had greater energy reserves, and they were flying at a faster velocity than the short-lived flies. And this was actually my first authored publication in a peer-reviewed journal, in the Journal of Insect Physiology. Okay, Graves, Luckenbill, and Nichols. Now, I'll tell you another story before we go on to this one. So, first time I attend the evolution meetings in Silomar, California. I got up early, as I always do. I went to breakfast. There's very few people in the room. I sit down, and then this old gentleman with white hair walks into the cafeteria, and I look up, and I said, that's got to be John Maynard Smith. Now, for those of you who don't know evolutionary biology, think of John Maynard Smith as at the Albert Einstein level of evolutionary biologists. So Maynard Smith goes through the line, walks out, and is walking directly towards my table. And I'm sitting there trying to figure out who is he coming to sit with, because it's only me over here. He comes over, sits down at the table across from me, and says, "You're Joe Graves, aren't you?" I said, "Yes. I've read some of your papers, and they're really good." And I was completely blown away. And then he said, "I hear you're going to work with Michael Rose." I said, "Yes, Dr. Maynard Smith, going to work with Michael Rose." And then he winked at me and said, "Well, you'll have to move him to the left a little bit." And he got up and walked away. So a few years later, working with Michael, we continue our experiments on postbone senescence, and they earned us a cover of Life magazine. Can we stop aging? There are scientists who believe we can and will, but would we really want to? And our work was so popular that it even earned a byline on Jay Leno's Tonight Show. He said, "Did you hear about those scientists in Irvine who have figured out how to make fruit flies live longer? I mean, aren't we trying to get rid of these things?" He was talking about the Mediterranean fruit fly, obviously. So now, this mechanism, this idea of how evolution happens with regard to aging. Well, it turns out that there are only two population genetic mechanisms that are consistent with an evolutionary theory of senescence. Now, if you think about the age effect at which alleles act or genes act, they can occur throughout an organism's lifespan. Those kinds of genes we call like housekeeping genes, or they can have specific periods in which they have an action. So if a gene is detrimental to the organism's evolutionary fitness early in life, then natural selection will remove that allele from the population. It doesn't matter what effect that allele has late in life, because individuals who hold it will not replicate into the next generation. Now, there are plenty of genes like this. One such condition is called progeria. It gives the appearance of premature aging because of a number of cellular pathologies occurring. And here, I don't have a pointer, but that young lady on the left-hand panel is 6 years old. On the right-hand panel is the same young lady about 2 to 3 years later. Okay, this is what progeria looks like. These individuals almost never reproduce. So these genes are never going to contribute to senescence. Now, next condition is mutation accumulation. This is when a gene has no effect on early life. Okay, so it is selectively neutral. But if it has deleterious effects on late life, and this happens often, then it can cause pathological conditions such as Alzheimer's and Huntington's chorea. Finally, the most insidious aspect of aging, one which our experiments demonstrated is extremely common, are genes that are beneficial early in life. Natural selection sweeps those so that they are at very high frequency. All the individuals within a species have this gene, despite their effect on late life being negative. Examples of this are cancer. The genes that help you develop from a single fertilized egg into a multicellular adult are derived from viruses such as RNA viruses, and they can contribute to the formation of cancer at late age when you are no longer reproductively capable. So later on in my career, when next generation sequencing tools were available, we were able to more accurately understand the genomic contributions to aging. Now, what you see here are data from flies that have dramatically different life history schedules, which we produced in the laboratory. So the A type have an accelerated development and short lifespan. The B type sort of have the standard lifespan of fruit flies in laboratory conditions. And the C type have postponed senescence. And what you see here is what we call in molecular genetics a Manhattan plot. And the red line represents the level at which the single nucleotide polymorphism is statistically significantly different from the group it's being compared to. And so what we were able to do across the Drosophila genome is show that there were multiple SNPs involved in lifespan, which is something that we had predicted in earlier studies, and we were finally able to do once we were able to do next generation sequencing. Now, earlier this month, I was asked by Culture Rico to write about what those experiments tell us about the ability to come up with treatments for aging in humans. And so, not surprisingly, the experimental foundations that we set in the 80s and 90s with regard to mutation accumulation and antagonistic pleiotropy, a UK biobank study using machine learning tools have associated the mutation accumulation mechanism with loci involved in cardiovascular disease, diabetes, osteoporosis, cataracts, immunological function, neurological, musculoskeletal, gastrointestinal, and respiratory diseases. The antagonistic pleiotropy mechanism was shown working with high cholesterol, lipid-related gallbladder and cholestasis. Now, the study didn't examine cancer genes, and I would have predicted that if they did, they would have found more SNP hits for those diseases than they did with regard to the others in antagonistic pleiotropy. So that's some of my genomics of adaptation work. From Voice in the Wilderness, there's a great danger to the future of our species if we allow systems of social injustice to govern the world. I've often been asked, should we teach students about the history of racism and eugenics in evolutionary biology? For those of you that are unaware, evolutionary biology has a deeply problematic history of studies that supported racism and eugenics. Now, I argue that we need to teach this history as we teach this discipline. Because one, this is a little gold mine of logical fallacies that can be utilized to teach students about the enterprise of science. So it has great pedagogical value. That story is full of villains and heroes, like one of my intellectual progenitors, Richard C. Lewontin, okay, who addressed the significance and meaning of human biological diversity. Now, I first got involved in this question when I was an assistant professor. I received a call in my office from a sociologist, Ben Bowser, who asked me had I read this book entitled The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. And I hadn't read it. I hadn't spent any great deal of time in this area, but he implored me to read the book and to reply to its genetical and statistical claims. And so I did so. And as I said, it was a gold mine of logical and methodological fallacies. And so I published two of the first papers that examined the problems with both the genetics and the statistics in this book. In Race and IQ Revisited, Figures Never Lie, but Often Liars Figure. So, now the bell curve had been featured on the cover of Time, Newsweek. Larry Sanders, then the president of Rutgers University, suggested that blacks might not have the genetic potential to succeed in higher education. At that time, I was really the only African American scholar who had the genetic and evolutionary credentials to examine the genetic claims in that book. And I did so, and as you can see from this headline in the Arizona Republic, is at this time I was at Arizona State, bell curve conclusions berated by ASU geneticist. And this is what led me to start writing a full-length treatment of evolutionary ideas and genetical ideas associated with race. The first was The Emperor's New Clothes, Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium, in which I examined the history of racial thinking in the Western world, how it had come about, and essentially what was wrong with it. Now, this book is still my most widely cited publication 23 years later. It does an excellent job of setting the stage on how these false pseudoscientific ideas came into existence, and of course, what was wrong with them. Now, in the sequel, The Race Myth, Why We Pretend Race Exists in America, I assume that the reader knows this bad history, and I specifically focus on how racial thinking was contributing to the ongoing pathologies in American society. And I can tell you that when I wrote The Race Myth in 2004, I honestly thought I would never have to write another book about race again, because the arguments were so clear. They were unassailable. And believe me, people tried, and they looked really badly trying to assail these arguments. But 2019, my good colleague Alan Goodman, former president of the American Association of Anthropologists, called me up and said, "Joe, we need to write another book." And so I agreed, and we we collaborated on the book, Racism, Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions. And we put this in question and answer format to go through all the misconceptions about human biological variation and social definitions of race that Alan and I had faced over the 30 years of our careers. Now, Ernie, in his wonderful introduction of me, used the term award-winning author. I hadn't been an award-winning author until Racism, Not Race, in which Kyrgyz Reviews listed it in 2021 as one of the best nonfiction books of the year. If you haven't seen the book, it has an endorsement from Ken Burns. I'm like, how the heck did they get Ken Burns to endorse this book? But he's on the back. And it was also listed as one of the best books about being Black in America in 2021. So the second award has been to A Voice in the Wilderness, which was listed by the Next Big Idea Club as one of the best science books of 2022. Now, by this time, my reputation as a scholar studying not just evolution, but its impact on human affairs was well established. PBS asked me to be one of the people interviewed in their film about the life and career of James Watson. And so you can see me in Decoding Watson, which came out in 2021. I wrote an opinion piece for CNN about Watson's views on race, which came out right around that same time. Now, what have I been doing lately? Lately, I've been focusing my work on changing the face of evolutionary biology, particularly microbial evolution research. This is my research group in the summer of 2018 at the annual Congress of Biocomputational Evolution in Action. To say the least, those of you who know the field would say, you've never seen a group that looked like this at an evolution meeting. Well, we can do this. By doing this work, we show that a lot of fallacies concerning why African Americans, why Latinos aren't going into evolutionary science are wrong. It's not because we're not interested in evolution. It's not because we have some inherited hatred of Darwinism. It has to do with the problems that people are examining and whether they have any relevance to our communities. And so all of these students here, okay, are people who are at the time pursuing graduate work and publishing in evolution journals. The young lady which would be for you guys to the left of me in the picture, okay, earned her PhD in molecular evolution 3 years ago. She's now a postdoc at UCLA in the laboratory of Pamela Yeh. Okay, so I'm going to skip this work because it's really not what's important. So we published a lot in this field. So take my word for it. Okay, but I want to go to, again, changing the narrative. These two young women, and this is a typo. Oh yeah, actually not a typo. December of 2022, which is 2 months ago, our group graduated 2 African-American PhDs in microbial evolution. Drs. Janelle Robinson, who's gone into industry. She worked for a sequencing company in New Jersey. And Dr. Mitzvah Fernander, who's working now with us in PREMIER, which stands for Precision Microbiome Engineering. Okay. We currently have at least 3 African-American women PhDs in our pipeline who will finish their PhD from 2024 to 2025. And by the way, I forgot to mention to the students that met with me this morning who are interested in bioinformatics, that as one of the directors of Precision Microbiome Engineering, I have 10 fully paid PhD-ships in my hands as I speak. So if you are interested in earning a PhD in bioinformatics related to microbiomes, you should apply to our program because I can fund your PhD. Okay, and by the way, these engineering research centers of excellence go for 10 years, not just 5. So we have this award for 10 years. Also, as I speak, the NIH is considering awarding us an award to become the hub for cloud and genomics computing training for all HBCUs and MSIs in the nation. We expect to get an official notification of that award by April. So what I'm saying to you is if you're interested in pursuing PhD research in this field, drop me an email. Now, we're also engaged in teacher support activities. We have an award through Amgen in which we are helping to put cutting-edge biotechnology laboratories in the classrooms of high school teachers. We did our first professional development training for these teachers on January 28th, and we completed that on February 4th. So going forward, we are the Amgen hub for Central North Carolina, providing these tools to help teachers increase their connection to modern biotechnology. Now, this is Premier, which I told you about. It's a consortium between Duke, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, North Carolina State, and UNC Charlotte. So if you don't want to come to me and do this work, you can come to any one of these other institutions and do this work. Okay. Finally, one of the most important avenues of work I have done in my career is taking on racial misconceptions in medicine. To say the least, the medical profession thinks in 19th century topology, the type of topology that Darwin's On the Origin of Species demolished, but they think that way with regard to how they're treating human beings in the 21st century. So my colleague, Dr. Andrea Dayrup, professor of pathology at Duke University, and one of the editors of Robin and Kumar's Basic Pathology, asked Elsevier to retain me as a consultant for the revision of the 10th edition of Robbins and Kumar Basic Pathology. Now, what have we done? Well, this is the first book in pathology that now has a section on health disparities. This is the first book in pathology that now has inclusive images, meaning we show skin diseases in multiple skin tones instead of just one. Okay. We've written essays, for example, in the New England Journal of Medicine. This one for genealogy, the myth of the genetically sick African. This one for academic medicine, in which we showed that the leading textbook in pediatrics was using problematic examples of race and ethnicity. As a result of our publication of this paper in March of 2022, the American Academy of Pediatrics issued a statement condemning racial medicine directly as a result of our work in this article. Now, I mentioned to folks that I have been doing virtual talks instead of showing up in person. Now you know why. These are all grand round lectures at America's leading medical colleges that we have given from 2021 to the present. Okay. We've also spoken before the board of medical examiners. So we're all born in various systems of social injustice. Some simply refuse to see this fact. Others resign themselves to accepting this and surviving the best they can. And then still fewer try changing this. So why does this work matter? Knowledge is power. Scientific knowledge in the 21st century may be the most significant for the survival of the human species. And as I say in Voice, there's a great danger to the future of our species if we allow systems of social injustice to govern the world. I guarantee you that if we allow this to continue, that the extinction of the human species will follow. And I say, particularly to the young people in this audience, that this is the charge We are leaving you in 2022. You must decide. You must come up with a vision for the way you want your world to be. And literally, I cannot, no pressure, but okay, space aliens, when they come to Earth, years in the future, will decide, based upon their archaeological evidence of our species, on what you do. They might arrive at a planet where we're still here, or they might have arrived at a planet that failed to address these existential issues at the beginning of the 21st century. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about my presentation.